Chapter 14, Along the Way. In 2008, the Christian big band Denver and the Mile High Orchestra placed third in the Fox Network's television show The Next Great American Band. Apart from the fact that Denver Bierman, the band's lead singer, is a longtime friend, my kids and I love listening to them. But more than their broad appeal, I appreciate their love for God and the way they point people to Him through their music. 4 years before their television appearances, our family attended one of their concerts. And midway through the evening, Denver shared that the band hoped to perform free open-air evangelistic concerts in the upcoming 2004 Olympic Games in Athens, Greece. At that point, just 4 months before the trip, they were still $50,000 short of the necessary funds. After his appeal, he gave the audience an opportunity to give toward their summer ministry tour. Immediately, I caught the vision. I knew their high-energy 12-piece band would be perfect for drawing and keeping crowds. What I didn't know was that my 12-year-old daughter, Dara, caught the vision too. During Denver's appeal, God spoke to her about the money she'd been saving for over a year to buy a small motor scooter. He wanted her to give it to the band instead. During the second half of the concert, Dara approached her mom and me and shared what God was asking her to do. "Would you be willing to write a check for the entire amount I have in my savings account?" she asked. "I promise to pay you back tomorrow." We questioned Dara to make sure she was certain this was from God, and she was. "I feel very clear that this is what God wants me to do," she assured us. Then we questioned her again to make sure we were certain, and we were. So we wrote the check. After the concert, Denver heard about Dara. Not only did her generosity encourage and deeply move him, but he was convinced it would serve as the loaves and fishes God would use to provide for their trip. A few months later, Denver and the Mile High Orchestra traveled to the Athens Olympics and shared its music with thousands of people from all over the world. After their concerts, the band members built relationships with people who listened to their music. They shared Christ with many unbelievers and encouraged several Christians from Islamic countries who had fled religious persecution in their homeland. And Dara? She started saving for that scooter again. She knew she wouldn't have enough money for over a year, and that was okay by her. She was thrilled to play a role in sending the gospel to another nation through one of her favorite bands. I was thrilled that Dara experienced her first taste of spirit-directed living and laboring, and it was a good taste. Even as a young girl, she was discovering that God wants to speak to her and guide her. God wants the same for all of us. He wants to interact with us throughout the day, regardless of where we are or what we're doing, even apart from special alone times we spend with Him in His Word. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, said that His followers follow His lead because they know His voice. It's His job to lead. It's our job to listen and obey. Our obedience to His in-the-moment promptings matter for eternity. We may not understand at the time why He asks us to do something, but He knows, and His ways and thoughts are higher than ours. Here's your hat. A friend of mine was shopping in a department store when suddenly he sensed God telling him to go to the men's area and look for the winter hats. Once he reached the men's department, he sensed God telling him, "Buy all the winter hats in the bin in front of you." Dwight, it was absolutely the strangest sensation. so strong and so weird. You know I'm a regular guy, and my mental faculties are in place," he later told me. "My eyes bugged right out of my head as I sensed God's presence. I thought perhaps other people could hear him speaking too." He chuckled. "Fortunately, all the hats were on sale." Rolling his cart up to the cash register and beginning to unload his basket, the store clerk paused, wrinkled her forehead, and then looked at him. "What are you gonna do with all of these hats?" "I don't know," he laughed. At that point, all he knew was God told him to buy the hats and that something strange was in the works. The clerk laughed too, saying this was her most unusual and memorable purchase ever, and my friend smiled, confirming it was his most unusual purchase in his lifetime of shopping. Perhaps trying to make him more comfortable, she mentioned that her husband purchased one of those hats and thought it was the warmest winter hat he'd ever owned. My friend then put all the hats, 2 big bags, in the trunk of his car and nearly forgot about them. Several weeks later, while driving home from work, he rounded the bend of his street and headed for his cul-de-sac when he encountered what looked like a garbage truck convention right on his street. Garbage trucks were parked everywhere, and all the garbage workers were standing outside their trucks talking with each other. It was an extremely unusual sight. But what made this sight even stranger than that was not one of the workers was wearing a hat. And this was the coldest day of the year in Colorado. I quickly pulled over, opened the trunk of my car, and had fun passing out all the nice new winter hats with the tags still on them, my friend told me as he began to weep. To share God's love that day with those cold men was such a spiritual highlight for me. My friend experienced what it means to be love in the middle, embodying God's love to others. But this privilege is not on reserve for a few. God is already speaking to you. God has given each one of us, including you, the ability to hear his voice. He doesn't limit himself to a select group of spiritually sensitive people equipped with some kind of direct line to heaven. Throughout his word, God promises that he speaks to us. The Lord confides in those who fear him. Psalm 25:14. Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, "This is the way, walk in it." Isaiah 30:21. I am the Lord your God, who teaches you what is best for you, who directs you in the way you should go. Isaiah 48:17. The Lord will guide you always. Isaiah 58:11. He who belongs to God hears what God says. John 8:47. It's pretty clear. God not only wants to speak to his people, he already is. Unfortunately, we don't listen very well. Like children who tune out their parents' voices, we can easily tune out God's voice. Sometimes we don't hear his voice because we don't want to hear it, because then we'd be accountable to obey. When my son was very young, I jokingly said, "It may be time to take you to the ear doctor." He looked panicked until I said, "Because you have so much trouble hearing what I've asked you to do." Now he looked sheepishly guilty. He knew he had some attentive adjusting to do. And the same could be said of us in our relationship with God. Sometimes our personal agendas drown out his voice. We rush through our lives and get so busy staying on task that without realizing it, we miss important kingdom-advancing moments all along the way. We become experts in tuning in the horizontal and tuning out the vertical. That's why Dawn and I didn't hesitate writing a check that night, enabling Dara to give away her savings. In a horizontal moment at a concert, Dara tuned in the vertical. She listened to God's voice. And although her request to empty her entire savings account initially concerned us, we remembered a woman in the Bible who emptied an entire bottle of expensive perfume to wash Jesus' feet in an expression of her love. We wanted to affirm Dara's desire to give everything out of her love for God. And we wanted to reinforce her faith and belief that God speaks to each of us and calls us to act in ways we hadn't planned. Most of all, we wanted to encourage her to keep listening for God's voice. Many of us need to change our listening habits from the horizontal stations that blare at us all day to God's vertical voice, which often comes in a still, small voice. He speaks to us regularly and often, but we easily miss him if we're not attentive. God didn't speak to Elijah the prophet in the mighty wind or the earthquake or the fire. He spoke to him in a gentle whisper. Shh. Perhaps God is speaking to you in a gentle whisper too. As you've listened to this book, maybe he's been nudging you in ways that are soft and subtle. Are you listening attentively? Can you hear him? Are you taking notes as you listen? Have you written down action steps that he wants you to take? Or is your life moving too fast to hear, record, and respond to his gentle instructional whispers? When I think of maintaining vertical and horizontal attentiveness, I think of what the martyred missionary Jim Elliot once wrote: "Wherever you are, be all there." It's become one of my favorite quotes. His words remind me to stay in the moment, avoid getting so caught up in life's busyness that I'm unable to hear God's voice and spontaneously obey him. You and I have the opportunity to embrace this everyday lifestyle of spirit-directed living and laboring as we listen for God's promptings in the moment and along the way. Interruptions are the ministry. By living a spirit-directed life, we follow the example of Jesus, who said, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me." Jesus' highest purpose was to fulfill the Father's agenda, not getting upset by interruptions, but embracing them as opportunities. Stopping along the way to take care of someone's immediate need was the norm of his life, not the exception. Is it yours? Time and time again, engaged with his surroundings and the timeliness of an opportunity presenting itself, Jesus slowed down or completely stopped what he was doing to minister to someone. That's a hard model for many of us to pattern our lives after, because we're more consumed by our type A personalities than we are about putting into practice God's plan A for reaching the world. For type A personalities like me, hearing God's voice in the moment and stopping along the way is difficult. After stating our destination, we race toward the goal, doing our best to avoid anyone or anything threatening to divert us from the quickest and most direct path to get there. We're known for our goals, plans, schedules, and sticking to them. Maybe you can relate. But God challenges and calls us to serendipitous ministry along the way. He rarely operates according to our schedules. He often prompts us to break out of them so we can minister to others in their moment of need. Unfortunately, we tend to become so reliant upon our schedules and routines that we view his promptings as interruptions rather than opportunities. It's a selfish way to live, and it dramatically scales down our potential for high-impact kingdom living. A friend of mine placed this message in a prominent location on his desk. Interruptions are the ministry. The first time I saw it, I asked him why it was there. Well, I've noticed over the years that it's easy to lose sight of what ministry is really about, he replied. We focus too much on tasks when ministry is ultimately about people. I need to constantly remind myself that people aren't an interruption to my work. They are my work. Likewise, God's promptings aren't interruptions to your life and ministry. They're the ministry of your life, and they're the life of your ministry. They're part of God's plan A for you. That's why Jesus often responded to along the way, in the moment, interruptive, and Spirit-directed ministry opportunities. While on his way to heal a dying young girl, he noticed that another woman touched his garment and received healing. He slowed down, embraced the moment, and engaged in an impromptu conversation that changed her life. Jesus was walking to Galilee and stopped at a well to get a drink of water. There he met a woman, but it wasn't by coincidence. More than water, she needed something to quench her spiritual thirst. Through insightful questions and words, Jesus forever impacted her life and many others who heard about him through this woman. Another time, Jesus passed through Jericho on his way to Jerusalem and noticed a man way up in a tree trying to catch a glimpse of him. Jesus realized Zacchaeus needed more than a glimpse. He needed an up-close encounter. So Jesus asked him, come down immediately so they could go hang out at his house together. These weren't planned ministry meetings, but they were not coincidences either, not from God's perspective. They were Spirit-directed ministry moments that brought God's kingdom to people in need all along the way, following his cues. If Jesus paid attention to interruptions and coincidences along the way, it's probably safe to say he wants you to do the same. He'll prompt you like an offstage director giving cues to an onstage actor. He'll prompt you when he wants you to notice someone, or when he wants you to slow down, stop, listen, or say something. He'll prompt you to pray urgently for a person or need. He'll prompt you to schedule a lunch or coffee with someone ahead of time or in the spur of the moment. He'll prompt you to make a phone call. text someone or write a note. He'll even tell you what to say during your call or in the note. He'll prompt you to place a hand on a shoulder, lend a listening ear, or simply be present with someone without saying anything at all. It might feel like a gentle nudge inside or something in your spirit going off like a soft beeping alarm. Your heart might beat a little stronger or your breathing might get fast. You may feel overwhelming compassion for a person or situation, that you must do something. And sometimes you'll hear that gentle whisper. You may not always be sure if it's him, but in the moment, learn to risk stepping out. You'll be unsure about where it will lead, but trust the one who's leading. When God brokers a divine appointment, you don't want to miss it. But most exciting of all, God is already prompting you. Whether or not you're listening, every day He invites you to join Him in building His kingdom. Now, before you start beating yourself up over your missed opportunities, please understand that even the most discerning person misses plenty of God moments. But every day, He whispers, guides, prompts, and leads us. Learning to listen requires that we reorient our lives from the horizontal to the vertical. Actually, it requires that we take both into account. We make ourselves aware of the people and circumstances around us, even the small stuff, while listening to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. What if we're wrong? When I speak to different groups about spirit-directed ministry, people often ask me, what if I get it wrong? What if I think I'm hearing from God, but it's really not Him, and then I do something that God didn't really prompt me to do? While this is a legitimate concern, a far more important concern should be that we'll miss critical and maybe even urgent in-the-moment ministry opportunities. In most cases, the worst that can happen if you get it wrong is possibly looking foolish to others. I wonder how often our fear of getting it wrong or looking foolish causes us to miss out on countless opportunities to obey God and minister to others. I'm willing to take that chance, aren't you? If the consequences of getting it wrong are great, you may want to be more cautious. You may even want to seek the counsel of others. But in the end, you are responsible for what God speaks to you. A dear friend of mine used to say, God can steer a moving car far better than He can steer a car that's stuck in park. Learn to respond to God's in-the-moment along-the-way promptings by taking action steps of obedience rather than allowing endless internal debates to paralyze you and prevent you from joining God in critical kingdom opportunities. People overtly consumed with personal safety, self-protection, self-image, and self-promotion usually won't expand God's kingdom much. If the fear of looking foolish, a nice way of saying pride, prevents you from stepping out, remember Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before He was nailed to a cross? He paid the price for your freedom with His life. At the moment when He had everything to lose, He surrendered His will to the Father and prayed, not as I will, but as you will. Don't allow the fear of being wrong or looking foolish keep you locked in park. When you listen for his voice and act on his promptings, you'll be amazed at how God drives you into Spirit-directed moments that will leave an eternal impact. Once you go down this road, you'll never want to look back. You may get it wrong from time to time. No biggie. Practice is the only way to get better at hearing his voice. The rest of Dara's story. What if Dara heard wrong? What if God hadn't spoken to her about sacrificially giving her savings so Denver and the Mile High Orchestra could go overseas? What if her own youthful sentiments were speaking to her rather than God's voice? Seriously, what's the worst that could have happened? As it turned out, God used Dara's sensitivity and obedience more than I would have ever imagined. Here's the rest of the story. A few months after Dara's gift, I shared her story while preaching at a church in Indianapolis. I'd never talked about it in public, and I hadn't planned on telling it in this message. But midway through my sermon, God repeatedly urged me to tell the story. I shared it at an appropriate place and continued preaching. At the close of the service, a distinguished-looking businessman named Bruce approached me. Dara's act of obedience had deeply moved him. God spoke to me about my own personal obedience through Dara's example, Bruce the businessman said. He went on to tell me that one of the multiple businesses he owned was a motorcycle shop. Dwight, God prompted me to give your daughter the scooter she was saving for. I think this is a test of my obedience. Maybe it's the first of many. I didn't think much about it until he called me 2 weeks later and asked me to go to a website and choose the scooter color she wanted. We followed his instructions, and a few weeks after that, the scooter arrived at my office. God's rewards for our small acts of obedience don't always tangibly come in this life. My wife and I made that clear to Dara. But I can't tell you how much it meant to our daughter to feel the smile of God's approval when she received a surprise blessing. She knew he was proud of her for putting him and his kingdom ahead of personal gain. And she'll know the rest of her life that God speaks in unexpected moments and in unexpected ways. Another amazing sequel. Believe it or not, Dara's story didn't end with a motor scooter. God continued to bless Dara's step of obedience. A year later, I returned to Indianapolis, so I asked Bruce the businessman to join me for lunch. As we sat down to eat, I could tell Bruce wanted to share something important with me. He also brought a friend with him. Dwight, he began, your story about how your daughter listened to God's voice really moved me. In fact, that's when I made a commitment to listen for his voice too. And over the past year, that change set in motion a God-led chain of events that radically altered my life, personal ministry, and my future. One by one, I've done my best to act on God's promptings, and the results have been amazing. Bruce then introduced me to the young man sitting next to him. Beaming, the man told me how he came to know Christ through Bruce's living testimony. And Bruce shared with me that he'd begun leading Bible studies for his employees, and a number of them made decisions to follow Jesus, which led to swimming pool baptism services for employees, friends, and family members who'd made spiritual commitments. And throughout all this, Bruce began sensing that God was calling him to redeem the time he'd lost, years of living for his own agenda. Bruce couldn't contain it any longer. God has opened doors for me to serve him overseas, he exclaimed. And it all began that morning when I made that first step of obedience to God's in-the-moment prompting to give a scooter to your daughter. As Bruce spoke, I thought about the chain of events God had set in motion through ordinary laborers being obedient to his in-the-moment promptings. God used a series of simple acts of obedience and created something bigger out of them. Denver and the Mile High Orchestra answered God's call to go to Greece. My daughter obeyed God by giving sacrificially to help them go. I obeyed God's prompting to tell her story in the middle of a message. Bruce, the businessman, obeyed God, giving Dara the scooter she'd been saving for. And God continued the chain of events by using Bruce to spiritually impact his family, friends, and company, and eventually led him into overseas missions work. Bruce, the businessman, soon became Bruce the missionary, and he's currently serving an unreached people group halfway around the world. What could God set in motion through your daily acts of obedience? Are you missing the chance to set off a chain of events because you're not listening for his voice? Do you ignore his promptings because you can't imagine far enough down the road what he might want to accomplish through your obedience? Remember, you may not understand his promptings in the moment. Dara didn't understand for a while. A few weeks after she gave her life savings, she asked me, "Daddy, how much would it cost to get a group the size of Denver and the Mile High Orchestra across the ocean on a plane?" "A lot," I replied. I didn't really want her to think her gift was small when she compared it to their great need. But she kept asking, "How much, Dad?" "Oh, I don't know exactly." I hoped that she'd let it go, but she didn't. When she discovered the total cost of their airfare, she said, "How embarrassing. My gift didn't do much." But I quickly replied, "Honey, it wasn't the size of your gift that captured God's attention. It was the amount left over. You gave it all. He measures the size of your obedience. He sees your heart of willing sacrifice, and he adds his immeasurable blessings. God will use what you gave to change lives." Little did I know, the ripples of Dara's obedience can be felt halfway around the world. That's what God does when his plan A, kingdom laborers, commit to follow his lead in the moment, along the way. Imagine what God's ready to do as you listen and obey.